Hello and welcome to today's video on the civil rights movement in the USA. I'm going to show you two timelines today. The first is going to show you how the civil rights movement that we study in our unit fits into a slightly broader context. And then the second is going to pick up some of the dates and some of the key people and events that we look at within our USA unit. And that brings me to a really important point. If we were studying the civil rights as a much bigger unit, there would be so many more stories, individual actions and events that we would look at in a lot more detail. The purpose of this video is to give you an overview of some of those key events and people that come under the civil rights theme in our wider USA unit. So in that sense, the events are quite selected because that's the purpose of what this video is for. So it's just to be aware that the history of this topic is much wider than this video can portray. Now, I wanted to just show you how the events in the 50s and 60s that we study in our unit fit into a broader context and a broader history. And again, this is just picking out a few key themes. Slavery was abolished in the USA in 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution. But there's a really key wording in this. It says that slavery is to be abolished except as a punishment. So what this means is that black people who were technically freed from slavery could potentially be criminalised if they were picked up and doing something that was perceived to be breaking the law, and then could be put back into a system where they were essentially working for the state, so their freedom was lost once again. And we get a period of criminalisation of black people. So just because the law changed with the 13th Amendment, it doesn't mean that black people in the USA were automatically free. In 1865, the KKK was established, which is a dominant feature of racist events and attitudes and horrific violence against black people in America that's dominated the history since that time. From 1865, we also start to see the development of the Jim Crow laws. Now, these might have been statewide or more nationally as these Jim Crow laws developed, and this legalised segregation. So this meant that from 1865 through to the mid-1960s, it was legal to segregate black and white facilities. So it's where you would see the signs up on walls saying this water fountain is for coloured people or white people, parks, schools, cinemas, every area of life for black and white people segregated. And the theory was that it would be separate but equal, but of course it was nowhere near equal. And we'll talk in our other timeline about how that shows itself in a variety of different ways. So we've got the period after 1865, this idea of black people being criminalised. We've got the idea of segregation developing. The Jim Crow laws really developed in the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s. There was also a huge increase of lynchings committed usually by KKK members, and then race riots that followed. It's interesting to note that this was also a period of time when the cinema was developing, and movies that were coming out at this point gave people a visual portrayal as black characters, as criminals, as villains, as somebody to be feared. So this idea of racism and criminalisation is fed through many different areas of life. Moving into the late 20s and early 30s, to link back to what you were doing last week, we've got the Great Depression, where the impact of unemployment was significantly higher in black communities. With the advent of World War II, we know about how that brought about the end of the Great Depression, but we know that whilst lots of middle-class white families prospered after World War II, there was a significant amount of poverty in the middle of that plenty. World War II, though, did start to develop the idea of activism and civil rights campaigning. And the membership of the NAACP grew massively during World War II. It went from about 50,000 members to 450,000 members. So black people's contributions in World War II and the fact that the military was starting to integrate really boosted the idea of civil rights campaigning and civil rights activism. 1948 is a key point because that's when all of the military services are integrated fully. So the military in the USA goes from being probably one of the institutions that had really poor record on racism to being one of the most advanced in terms of integration by the late 1940s. The 1950s and into the 60s then is where we focus our study within our broader USA unit on the civil rights movement, and you can see that there are just a couple of the key dates picked out there. One of the really key changes in legislation, in law, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. However, that doesn't mean that people's experience suddenly becomes positive. And you can see as we move into the later 60s and into the 70s that race riots, police brutality, continued prejudice is still an everyday feature of black Americans' lives. 1965 to 1967, there were huge numbers of race riots across the USA, and in 1967 there were riots almost simultaneously across 125 cities. The 1970s onwards sees a shift perhaps from segregation towards the incarceration of black Americans. And from the 1970s onwards, a black person was 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white person. And this was definitely influenced in part by government policy. President Clinton, after he was president, admitted that government policy towards the prison system definitely led to extremely unfair situation of many, many more black people being incarcerated compared to white people. And this is a situation of riots, of incarceration, of police brutality that has continued into US society and is still a really prevalent issue that we talk about now. And I've just noted on there the George Floyd murder, just one of many, but perhaps one of the most well-known at the current time. So hopefully that gives you an idea of where our kind of 50s and 60s study fits into a broader period, moving from a time of slavery to criminalisation, segregation, incarceration. I'm going to add in this timeline now, which just looks at our time period in a little bit more detail. So we've already mentioned that World War II saw a growth of the NAACP from 50,000 to 450,000. Now, black people's contribution to the war was significant, both at home and on the front line. And this had developed this idea of activism and civil rights campaigning. Black people had been treated extremely unfairly in the military, with black nurses being excluded from treating white soldiers, for example. Black soldiers being asked to do either the most menial or the most extremely dangerous jobs. 1948, though, is a significant shift forward, with the military becoming fully integrated. What we can see then on this timeline, the different colours, the purple dates are to do with the theme of education and landmark dates in developments in black people accessing more equal facilities. The Brown versus Topeka case was the case of a student called Linda Brown, and her parents wanted her to be able to go to a white school, an integrated school. So with the support of the NAACP, the Topeka Board of Education was taken to the Supreme Court, and eventually the Supreme Court ruled that the idea of separate but equal has no place and was significantly psychologically damaging to young black Americans and to their future. So that was a real landmark case, but again, just because the Supreme Court says something has changed, it doesn't mean that people's experience changes. And local state governors would do things like shut down all of the schools rather than let black children attend what they saw of as a white school. The 1957 Little Rock High School case was a case of black students wanting to attend Little Rock High School, but the amount of racism and violence that they experienced meant that they needed a federal escort. And again, the governor shut all schools rather than let black children go to what they saw as a white school. The James Meredith case in 1962 was to do with the Mississippi University. He wanted to enrol, they tried to stop him. It led to huge amounts of violence, and riots often referred to as the Battle of Oxford. But JFK stepped in and James Meredith was given federal agent support in order to complete his degree. So the purple ones are to do with education. The green dates are some of the key events in the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks in 1955 is famous for refusing to give up her seat on a bus for a white person. This sparks the Montgomery bus boycott and the establishment of the Montgomery Improvement Association. This sees Martin Luther King emerge as a key leader, one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. Some of the events that he went on to be extremely influential in then was the March to Birmingham, the Washington March. It was in Washington that he gave his very famous I Have a Dream speech. Also the protests in Selma, which led to some really key pieces of legislation. Martin Luther King, though, was assassinated in 1968, which just shows that because the law has changed, there's still a huge amount of work to be done. Also in the early 60s, the idea of the civil rights movement was direct but peaceful protest. So there are examples of sit-ins in lunch counters, for example, and the Freedom Riders of 1961. So to talk about the blue dates, these are the legislation that we've referred to. 1964 is the Civil Rights Act. This officially in law ends segregation. It means that black American students have access to the same kind of education that white young American students do, and it means that the government has the ability to monitor government buildings and government projects to make sure that black people are not discriminated against. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is key in allowing black Americans to be able to register to vote without taking a literacy test. It also means that federal agents can monitor registration, and if registration of black communities dips beneath 50%, it gives them an opportunity to act, because that would be seen as evidence of discrimination. Other laws that changed: 1967, the law forbidding interracial marriage is deemed unconstitutional, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 makes the access to affordable housing for black families much easier to achieve. There were, though, in the mid-1960s, and we mentioned these in the bigger timeline, race riots across the USA. In 1967, the government had to reflect on why this was going on and what the causes of it were, and they commissioned the Kerner Report. The Kerner Report recognised that there was systemic police bias and brutality, and recognised the massive economic issues that black communities faced. So despite these changes in law, it's still clear that the experience of black families and black communities was still massively behind the opportunities that many white families were experiencing. We've mentioned Martin Luther King. Another really key figure in the civil rights movement was Malcolm X. He worked more specifically perhaps with young black Americans in the Muslim community, and he was really seen as a figurehead for the rights of young black Americans. He was assassinated, though, in 1965, which is again evidence that there are still huge problems despite changes in the law. I hope then that this timeline has given you a brief overview of some of the really key events, how they link together and how you might categorise them. We've got the ideas to do with World War II and the military. We've got the education events, the civil rights movement events, changes in the law, and then some of the broader issues that show that there are still significant problems in terms of racism, prejudice and discrimination.